Okay, so here's a question nobody ever actually asks you. When was the last time you were completely, embarrassingly, structurally wrong about something? Not like wrong about a restaurant recommendation. Wrong in a way where the correct answer was sitting there the whole time and everyone, including the experts, including the textbooks, including the person whose job it literally was to know, looked right at it and said, "Nope, that's ridiculous." Because that happens more than we like to admit. And not in ancient history, not in the Dark Ages when people thought the sun was a chariot. In living memory, in peer-reviewed journals, in the careers of actual scientists who had to sit in rooms and defend positions that turned out to be spectacularly, almost cosmically, incorrect. This is a story about the gap between what we thought we knew and what turned out to be true. And it's weirder and more recent than you're expecting. The part that gets me, the part I can't stop thinking about, is that being wrong isn't the failure here. The failure is something much more specific. It's being so confident in the old answer that you stop looking for the real one. That's where things go sideways. That's where patients die, discoveries get buried, and scientists spend decades defending maps of a territory they never actually visited. Let's start with your stomach. Specifically, let's start with the idea that your stomach is basically a war zone that nothing alive could survive. High acid, constant motion, an environment so hostile that for most of the 20th century, medical consensus had a very simple explanation for stomach ulcers. Stress and spicy food break down the stomach's protective lining, and then acid eats through. Case closed. Here's an antacid. Maybe eat less curry. This was the official story for so long that it became the kind of fact you just knew. Doctors knew it. Medical students memorized it. Drug companies built entire product lines around it. The stress and acid model of ulcers was as settled as anything in medicine. Then, in 1982, an Australian physician named Barry Marshall looked at his biopsy results and noticed bacteria living in the stomachs of patients with ulcers. Not near the stomach, in the stomach. In the acid, in the supposedly uninhabitable acid. He showed his colleagues. His colleagues told him he was wrong, not politely. They told him he was wrong in the specific way that academic medicine tells you you're wrong, which is by ignoring you at conferences and rejecting your papers and suggesting, ever so professionally, that you reconsider your career. Marshall was so frustrated that in 1984, he did something that is either the most unhinged or most committed thing in the history of gastroenterology, depending on how you feel about it. He cultured a petri dish full of the bacteria, Helicobacter pylori, confirmed he didn't have ulcers, and drank it. He got sick. He developed gastritis. He took antibiotics and recovered. He had, essentially, given himself a disease and cured it to win an argument. It still took over a decade for the medical community to fully accept that most peptic ulcers are caused by a bacterial infection and are, in the majority of cases, curable with a simple course of antibiotics. Over a decade. During which time, millions of people were told to manage their stress and watch the spicy food, when what they actually needed was a 10-day prescription. Marshall and his colleague Robin Warren got the Nobel Prize in 2005, which is the scientific community's way of saying, you were right, we were wrong, here's a medal, we will never discuss the lost decade again. But this isn't just a story about one stubborn bacteria and one even more stubborn Australian. It's a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. The pattern is this. Science doesn't actually work the way we were taught it works. We were taught it was this clean, progressive machine. Hypothesis, experiment, result, update the textbook, move forward. And sometimes it does work that way. But the real story, the human story, is that science is done by people who have reputations and funding and careers and deep emotional attachments to the things they already believe. Which means that when the correct answer arrives, and the correct answer requires everyone to admit they were wrong, the correct answer often has to wait. Sometimes it waits years. Sometimes it waits decades. Sometimes the person who figured it out has to die before the field catches up. Take continental drift. Take Alfred Wegener, a German meteorologist who noticed in 1912 that the coastlines of South America and Africa fit together like puzzle pieces, not just vaguely, specifically. The rock formations match, the fossils match, the mountain ranges line up. Wegener looked at this and said, in what I imagine was a very reasonable voice, what if these continents used to be connected and moved apart? The response from the geological community was not, interesting hypothesis, let's investigate. It was closer to, who let the meteorologist in here? Geologists hated this idea. Not because the evidence was bad, the evidence was sitting right there, but because nobody could explain the mechanism. What force could possibly move an entire continent? The idea seemed physically impossible. And in science, when an idea seems physically impossible, it often gets filed under "nice try" until someone finds the mechanism. Wegener died in 1930 on an expedition in Greenland, never having seen his idea accepted. It took until the 1960s, when scientists started mapping the ocean floor and found the mid-ocean ridges and figured out plate tectonics, for continental drift to go from that ridiculous meteorologist's pet theory to the foundational framework of modern geology. His crime was being 50 years early. Which raises the uncomfortable question: what are we 50 years early on right now? What's the current Alfred Wegener, sitting in a room somewhere, being politely destroyed at a conference for saying something that will be in every textbook by 2080? That question is going to sit there for a minute. We'll come back to it. Because first I want to talk about something that hits a little closer to home. Something that affects roughly half the people alive, has shaped entire fields of medicine and psychology, and was considered at best niche and at worst dangerous for most of the last century. The female orgasm. I know. Stay with me. For most of recorded medical history, female sexual pleasure was either ignored, pathologized, or explained away. But I'm not talking about the Victorian-era stuff. That's well documented and depressing. I'm talking about something more specific and more recent: the anatomy of the clitoris. For years, the clitoris was described in medical textbooks as a small external structure. A button. That was it. The full internal structure, the fact that it extends internally, that it's actually a fairly substantial anatomical organ with internal bulbs and crura that surround the vaginal canal. This was not in standard anatomy textbooks. Not properly. Not accurately. Some of it was known to specialists, ignored, then lost, which is its own depressing story about what tends to get funded and studied. It was only in 1998 that Australian urologist Helen O'Connell published the first complete anatomical description of the full clitoris, using MRI and dissection. 1998, not 1898, 1998. The year Google was founded. The year Titanic won the Oscar. The year you might have been in elementary school, depending on your age. That's not ancient history. That's the year your parents were already adults. And the medical community's understanding of a basic piece of female anatomy was, at that point, still incomplete in a way that had real consequences for how pain conditions were diagnosed, for how surgery was performed, for how half the population understood their own bodies. O'Connell's work was initially not particularly celebrated. It was updated, expanded, confirmed by later researchers. It slowly filtered into textbooks. And now, it's there. But the window between "this is the actual anatomy" and "this is what gets taught in medical school" was not a matter of months. The pattern again. Correct answer arrives, correct answer waits. Let's do a faster one. Less historically grim, more immediately disorienting. For a long time, scientists believed that the human brain stopped developing in your mid to late 20s. Development complete, hardware locked. Whatever you'd built by then was what you were working with for the rest of your life. This belief had enormous downstream effects on how we thought about addiction, about trauma, about education, about criminal justice. If the adult brain is fixed, then we're essentially asking moral and legal questions about a finished product. Then, neuroplasticity happened, which isn't a new discovery exactly. The concept was being discussed from the 1960s forward, but the proof took a long time to go mainstream, and the fuller picture is genuinely recent. The brain rewires itself throughout your entire life. New neural connections form, old ones weaken. Experiences physically change the structure of the organ. The hippocampus, the area involved in memory and navigation, was shown in a famous 2000 study to be measurably larger in London taxi drivers than in controls, and larger the more years of driving experience they had. The brain had literally grown in response to use, which means everything you're doing right now, the job, the relationships, the doom scrolling, the 1 a.m. rabbit holes, the half-finished meditation app you downloaded with good intentions in February and have an open sense. All of it is quietly, continuously, physically reshaping your brain. Not metaphorically, structurally. That should feel like something. The thing you do at 11 p.m. when you're tired and your guard is down is not consequence-free. And not because of some vague wellness idea, because of how the hardware actually works. Every time a neural pathway fires, it gets slightly more likely to fire again. Habits aren't just habits, they're architecture. But here's the part that cuts both ways. It also means the architecture is never finished. which is the better news. The brain that got you here is not necessarily the brain you're stuck with. The research on cognitive recovery, on skill acquisition in adulthood, on therapy rewriting trauma responses, all of it rests on plasticity being real. We thought the brain was a fixed machine. It's more like a living city. Roads get added, old routes get abandoned, some neighborhoods gentrify, some get worse. It's always in motion. Okay, something even more recent. Something so recent that scientists used to think this was crazy is really just scientists figured this out 10 minutes ago in academic time. The human gut. Not the stomach. We did the stomach. The gut. The microbiome. The roughly 38 trillion microorganisms living in your intestines right now, which is approximately the same number as the human cells in your entire body. You are, by cell count, almost as much microorganism as you are human, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like something someone says at 2 a.m. after going too deep on a biology subreddit, but is just true. For most of modern medicine, the gut was a digestive organ. It broke food down. It absorbed nutrients. It had some immune function. It was not considered a player in anything involving the brain, mood, behavior, or mental health. The idea that the gut and the brain talk to each other, constantly, bidirectionally, in ways that affect mood, anxiety, cognition, was fringe stuff a couple of decades ago. The gut-brain axis, they call it now. There's a nerve, the vagus nerve, running directly from your gut to your brainstem, carrying signals in both directions. Your gut produces about 90% of your body's serotonin. Not your brain, your gut. The implications of this are still being worked out. Research into the microbiome is genuinely one of the most active and chaotic frontiers in medicine right now, full of overhyped claims and real discoveries happening side by side, often in the same paper. But the basic fact that the trillions of organisms in your digestive system are involved in your mental state, your immune system, your inflammation responses, possibly your susceptibility to certain diseases, was considered speculative within recent memory. Now, it's considered a starting point, which means every time you wrecked your gut microbiome with a rough round of antibiotics, every processed food phase, every stress period that manifested as stomach problems, your body was telling you something the medical literature wasn't ready to confirm. The body knew. The textbooks were catching up. There's a version of this story that makes you feel good about science. Look how much we've learned. Look how the method works, even if slowly, even if imperfectly. And that version is true. It's real. Every one of these discoveries happened because someone did the work, ran the experiments, published the results, and enough people eventually paid attention. But there's another version that's harder to sit with. It's this. The distance between a correct discovery and an accepted discovery is never just about evidence. It's about who's doing the discovering. It's about whether the people being dismissed have the credentials, the funding, the institution, the nationality, the gender to be taken seriously. Barry Marshall was an unknown doctor in Perth. He wasn't at Johns Hopkins. Alfred Wegener was a meteorologist in a room full of geologists. Helen O'Connell was studying anatomy that the field had quietly agreed wasn't worth studying. The evidence was there in all three cases. What was missing was permission. And that's not a conspiracy. It's not even malice usually. It's just how systems work when they've been around long enough to think they've figured most of it out. Systems develop immune responses to ideas that threaten them, the same way bodies develop immune responses to foreign objects. The immune response doesn't know whether the foreign object is dangerous or life-saving. It just knows it's new. This is the thing that nobody tells you in school when they teach you that science is a self-correcting process. They mean it. It is. It does correct. But self-correcting sounds clean and automatic, like a spell checker catching your typos in real time. The actual process is more like someone spends a decade being ignored, then someone else confirms their work, then a few more people pile on, then eventually a critical mass is reached and the textbooks get rewritten, and everyone acts like this was always the obvious conclusion. That's still working. It's just not pretty. So here's where we land. The history of science isn't a straight line. It's more like a city being built by people who are simultaneously trying to live in it, tear down the parts that aren't working, and argue with each other about where the park should go. Progress happens. Real, important, life-saving progress. But it happens in spite of the system as much as because of it. And it happens on a timeline that has less to do with how true something is, and more to do with how threatening it is to believe. You have bacteria causing your ulcers. Your continents are moving under your feet at a few centimeters a year. Your brain is being rewired as you watch this. Your gut is running a parallel nervous system that you've never once been asked about in a standard checkup. All of this was considered wrong, fringe, unserious, or simply unimportant within the lifetimes of people who are still alive, which means we have to hold what we currently know with a specific kind of grip, firm enough to act on it, loose enough to let it go when something better comes along. Not skepticism for its own sake, not, well, scientists have been wrong before, as a reason to ignore the best available evidence. That's a different failure mode and an even more costly one. This specific thing, the ability to say, I believe this now because it's the best we have, and I'll update when the evidence says to. That's not weakness. It's actually the hardest intellectual move there is, because the evidence doesn't always arrive with a label. Sometimes it arrives looking like a weird biopsy result in Perth. Sometimes it arrives looking like a coastline that fits too well to be a coincidence. Sometimes it arrives in a moment where the correct answer is so obvious in retrospect that future people will genuinely struggle to understand how anyone ever believed anything else. We are almost certainly living in one of those moments right now. The question worth keeping, the one I keep turning over, is not, what did they get wrong in the past? It's, what are we absolutely certain of right now that looks exactly like all of those things? What's the belief that's so established, so agreed upon, so woven into how medicine or physics or psychology works, that pointing at the evidence against it gets you laughed out of the conference? I don't know. That's the honest answer. If I knew, it wouldn't be a mystery. But someone knows. Someone is sitting in a room right now, looking at results that shouldn't be possible according to the current model, wondering if they're crazy or if everyone else is. And based on how this has gone every single time before, there's a decent chance it's everyone else.